Hello, and welcome back to Tomato Tomato. Today I am joined with a special guest, Professor Luke Gorton from the University of New Mexico. He has a master's in linguistics, a PhD in classics, and an impressive 4.6 rating on Rate My Professor. I was so honored to speak with him, and I hope you will learn just as much as I did from his interview. So let's get into it. This is Professor Luke Gorton. Welcome, Professor Gorton. Welcome to the podcast. I'm really happy to be interviewing you. Could you please tell me a little bit about the work you're involved in pertaining to language and dialects and some of the work you do in your profession?
Yeah, I've been interested in language for a long time. I took Spanish and Latin when I was in high school, so I was already kind of hooked. I didn't know I was going to teach languages someday, but I knew I liked them. In college, I minored in ancient languages, including Greek and Hebrew. And then I decided to go to grad school for linguistics. So I did a master's degree in linguistics. And that's when I really started studying language professionally as part of academia. I went on to do a PhD in classics, and classics really focuses on the ancient world in general. You can do anything you want because language and culture is just so connected. You can't really have one without the other, it seems like. So I really focus, my research now focuses on those connections between ancient language and ancient culture. I still do a lot of work on ancient religions. I teach a big Greek mythology class at the University of New Mexico, and my research is in the area of ancient Mediterranean religions, which includes Greek religion, Roman religion, ancient Judaism, very early Christianity when it was just getting started. So that's the kind of stuff that I work on.
And how can you give me an example of how, for example, the culture of America is embedded in English, like how we speak English, how our culture comes through our language?
Yeah, so the way we use words, things we just kind of take for granted, really bubbles up. So there's all these different grammatical things that make a difference in the English language that we may not even think about until we learn another language and realize that it's different, right? So, for instance, our pronoun system. So our pronoun system is different from most languages because the second person pronoun you, we don't actually distinguish between singular and plural. And that's such a deep thing, right? So when you say you, it can be singular, it can be plural. Now there's ways you can make it plural, like if you say you guys or y'all or whatever part of the country you're from, there's different ways to do this, right? But you don't have to, and people don't always do that, right? Whereas pretty much every other language that I've ever studied distinguishes singular and plural you, right? We talk a lot about pronouns and gender today. So we have, these pronouns he and she and her and him. And then the old neuter was it, which today would probably be considered offensive to apply to a person, but it didn't used to be. In Old English, you could refer to anything as it if it was a neuter gender. So we're struggling with our pronoun system to try to, make it bigger than just he and she. But some languages, in fact, most languages have a bigger struggle than us because the gender is much more embedded into their linguistic system, even just Spanish, for instance,
right?
And the Romance languages where it's nouns are gendered masculine and feminine in a way that we just don't have in English, right? And if you go to, for instance, Hebrew, not only are third person pronouns gendered, but second person pronouns are gendered. So if I say you, I have to gender you. I can't say you without gendering you, which imagine how complicated that would be if we had that in English. At least today, when you say you, you're not gendering the person, right? So those are the kinds of subtle things that lurk in language. When you study it, you're able to sort of, like I said, drag them out into the open and understand a little better some of the oddities of our own language and how the language we speak shapes the world that
that moment when you realize that you haven't washed your sheets in over 3 months and you think, is that unhygienic? But then you figure, they're my sheets. What do I care? And then there's that other moment when you wake up with pimples all over your face. Yeah. This podcast brought to you by your own stupidity. So for the general context of explaining this stuff, how do languages evolve? And can we think of the evolution of accents and dialects as a process similar to the evolution of language?
Yeah, I think the answer to your second question is pretty easy. Yes, absolutely. There can be a lot of connections made between biological evolution and language evolution, but there are some differences as well. So language evolution doesn't necessarily only have two parents. So of course, most animals that participate in sexual reproduction have exactly two parents. They're getting their genes from two places. But languages aren't like that. Languages oftentimes only have one parent. They descend from one older language, but it's not infrequent that languages can have more than two parents. So for instance, they may overall descend from one language grammatically, but then they borrowed a ton of words from other sources. And so they might look more like other languages as well. We basically descend from Old English, and Old English descended from Proto-Germanic. So in that sense, we are related to other Germanic languages like German and Dutch and the Scandinavian languages. But we've also borrowed a huge amount of our vocabulary from other sources. So for instance, the French, with William the Conqueror in 1066, invaded England, took it over, and French people essentially, or French speaking people, ruled England for hundreds of years. And Queen Elizabeth is still descended from them today. So French was the official language of England for 400 years, essentially. And while the lower classes were still speaking English, all the upper classes were speaking French. During that time period, we borrowed a huge amount of words from French. We've also borrowed a huge amount of words from Latin and from Greek. So even though our, official parent, when you go and look at the charts or whatever, it'll say English is descended from Old English, which it is. But we've borrowed so many words from these other sources that it's kind of like we have multiple parents. So the biological evolution metaphor is the good one, but we want to make sure that we understand that it can be bigger than that as well. We're not restricted to two parents in language evolution, but in many cases it works the same way. It works organically, just like biological evolution does. So I think it's overall a good metaphor to understand how languages evolve. As far as the ways that they evolve on every level of language. So they can evolve phonetically or phonologically, which means the sounds that we're using, those sounds can evolve. So a sound that may not have been in the English language 1500 years ago might be a very common sound today because the language has evolved. So there's that kind of evolution. There's morphological evolution, which is the evolution of the meaning bearing units of words. So a particular word that might have meant, or part of a word that meant something at one point might come to mean something else later. And then there's syntactic evolution, where the order of the words can evolve. And so you can say things in a different order than you used to be able to say them in, for instance. And then of course there's semantic evolution, which is probably the kind that's the most intuitive to us. You don't have to be a linguist to understand semantic evolution, because we see words changing every day, because some word will mean something that it just didn't mean 10 years ago. And so we can kind of see this in real time. So all of these things happen. They're always happening all the time. You can't really step out of that process. And another difference between language evolution and biological evolution is that language evolution happens much quicker usually. So we can study, if we have texts from 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, we can see how far we've evolved just in those 1,000 or 2,000 years. You don't have to wait a million years for something to happen. So it's actually much easier to study in many ways.
What would cause a language or dialect to fade or disappear completely?
Yeah, there's a number of different answers to this question, but usually it has something to do with social pressure. People are speaking a language because it is cool, because it is useful, because their friends and their family and the people they know are speaking it. So one of the processes that can cause a language to disappear is when it's no longer cool, or when it's no longer useful to those people, or when their friends and family are mostly not speaking it anymore. Those are the kinds of reasons that people might choose to stop speaking a language. Usually it happens over several generations. Usually, an older generation might still speak it okay, and then a middle generation might speak a few words, and then the kids who are coming up might not speak it at all, which means that in 100 years, that language will probably be gone, maybe less than 100 years. We're seeing that all over the world today. There are languages dying all over the world. And when I was in linguist school, we were told, if you really want to be a good linguist, go somewhere in the world with a dying language and learn it and record it before it's dead, because there's so many languages that are dying. Some of them are Native American languages in this country or elsewhere in the Americas. That there's lots of languages in Asia, especially Southeast Asia, that are dying. Africa, of course, and there's various processes that are at play. But one of the biggest ones today is globalization, because the world is shrinking, because it's just so easy to communicate with each other all over the world and fly anywhere you want in the world in a short amount of time. We don't need, just from a practical human perspective, we don't need as many languages as we used to have when the world was a much bigger place. And if you were born in, I don't know, England, you were going to probably die in England and never go anywhere else your whole life. Or if you were lucky, you might go over to France one time or something. So the world used to be this really big place. It was very hard to get from place to place. And so there were individual languages in every little corner of the world. And that's just so many thousands of languages if you think about it. But with the rise of modern transportation and communication, it makes more sense to most people to be able to speak a wider language.
So with like an accent or a dialect, how would an accent or dialect form out of a language? And then how would that meld and disappear and sort of fade?
Yeah. So accents and dialects form. And if you think about it, an accent is just like the baby phase of a dialect. You're starting to do things differently, but it's still basically the same language and you can understand each other. Just other people think you sound weird and you think they sound weird, right? So accents and dialects form when throughout history, they've almost always formed when there was some geographical separation between people. Which again, for most of human history, it didn't have to be a lot of geographic separation. It could be there was a mountain range between you and another group. And so it was hard to get over it and hard to get, over to where they were, and they couldn't come over very easily to where you were. And so you would have your own way of speaking and they would have their own way of speaking. This would naturally develop through language evolution, which we were talking about earlier, where over time, you and your group that you talk to a lot, which might only be a couple hundred or even a couple thousand people, would start pronouncing words differently. You might start saying words in different order. That's the syntactic evolution. And you would definitely start using words differently, right? That's the semantic evolution. So think of all the ways that people changed the meaning of words on the local level. Like if you just go to a high school, there might be words that people only in your high school know what that word means. Or only in your social group at that high school even. So imagine that, but on a bigger scale, like your little group is living in a little valley of a river, and then there's some other group that's living 2 miles away, but you never see them except rarely. You're going to evolve things differently, and they're going to evolve things differently. And if you multiply that by 50 years or 100 years, you're going to be talking a lot differently than them. You'll still probably be able to understand them, but you're going to be talking a lot differently than them. And then if you multiply that by 1,000 years, it might become so big, those differences, that you have a hard time understanding each other. And that's when we would say you're a different language, essentially, at that point. So the accents and dialects basically evolve just because language evolves. And so whenever people split up and they're not necessarily in the same social group, usually for geographical reasons historically, but today maybe not always for geographical reasons, maybe for cultural reasons, you're going to have accents and dialects, and then ultimately, eventually, languages evolve.
This podcast brought to you by those incredibly annoying and patronizing phrases like, "There was nothing great about the Depression." Ugh, stop calling it that. There was nothing great about poverty and wealth inequality. It was not the Great Depression. Would you have wanted to live through that? Because I wouldn't. I'm so much better than you. And then what connections can one make, if any, between language, between dialects, and things like that, and accents, in power structures, political conflicts of today, or social justice issues? What connections can we make?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of connections to be made, especially on the sociolinguistic plane, because we humans, it seems like we have this module in our heads that judges people. It's what we call unconscious bias, right? We all have unconscious bias deep in our brains. It doesn't make us terrible people because we all have it. It just means that we want to try to be more aware of it, right? And unconscious bias works in a number of different ways. Obviously, we talk about skin color a lot, being biased against somebody because of their skin color, which is important to talk about. But another thing that gets talked about less, but I think is probably just as important, is that we have this little module in our heads that tries to make us discriminate against people because they sound differently than us, right? Of course, if they're speaking a totally different language, we know they're speaking a totally different language and they're different from us. But sometimes there are people who are speaking the same language as us, but they're speaking it differently, right? They're speaking a different dialect, or they have a different accent. And those kind of biases are all over the place, right? And honestly, they get faced and confronted less often than skin color bias today, right? Because we talk about skin color bias a lot, which is great, but we don't talk as much about dialect bias and accent bias. And when I've taught linguistic classes in the past, I have often done experiments with my students, and I told them I'm doing it. What I would say is, I'm going to start talking in a different accent, and just be honest, tell me how this makes you feel, right? This is my native accent, but I can do other accents. I grew up in the American South. So I can do a white Southern accent. I can do a black Southern accent because I grew up around white Southerners, black Southerners, and many of my friends in childhood were from those groups. And when I say white Southerners, I really mean rural white Southerners with like a traditional Southern accent. So sometimes I would just say, all right, guys, we're going to do a little experiment. I want you to see how you feel about me when I talk like this. And I could see their faces change. And so I would say, okay, just be honest. Like, how did that make you feel? And you know, there are biases attached to some particular accent, right? So I wanted to, when I teach a class like that, I like to bring that out into the open and just help people realize that there are these unconscious biases that are lurking in our heads. I just use that accent because it's one of the accents that I can do that's native to me. But you can do this with anything, right? There are so many accents out there that you can that make people feel certain ways that sometimes might be positive. Like if I did a British accent, there might be some negative connotations, but there might also be some positive connotations from some people, right? But some accents will just get negative connotations from many other people. So those biases, which are not intentional, like I don't think people sit around wanting to be biased against people because of their accents, but it's just something that's deep in our heads that we want to be aware of, that can impact our decisions and the way we treat people of all types, even if we don't want to, or even if we don't mean to. So the more we're aware of those kind of things, the more we're able to stop ourselves and say, wait, I felt this flash of bias or emotion about this person because they're talking a certain way, but I don't want to be biased against them. I want to treat them like a human being. I want to treat them with equality and fairness. So I think being aware of it goes a long way.
Yeah, that's great to know. I mean, I think linguistic profiling is incredibly unconscious, and we don't talk about it ever because it's not like a thing that people, if I said to someone on the street, oh, do you know what linguistic profiling is? I doubt that people would know exactly what I'm talking about. This episode brought to you by that video where the doctors talk to anti-vaxxers and they're like, remember the time you got polio? No, you don't, because you were vaccinated. Ha! Got you. Busted. Hashtag conservative self-own. And then what would you want everyone to know about language or about dialects or about the work you're involved in, and why?
Yeah, I would just like everyone to know that language is super fun, super cool, and super important, because obviously we use it every day. We're all talking to each other. We're all speaking. Even sign language counts. Sign language counts as a language too. So if you use sign language, that still applies to you. So we're all using language every day. It's a fundamental part of the human experience. And there are so many things that we know without knowing we know them. We were just talking about bias and how that's sort of deeply lodged in our consciousness, but there's lots of other things that are maybe happier and more fun to talk about that are also deeply lodged in our consciousness. We just know so much about how to use our native language, and if you learn another one, you know a lot, maybe a little bit less, but still a lot about how to use that one too. And so the study of linguistics is I think fun for everyone because it's really just a process of self-discovery. We're all learning about things we already know, but we're dragging them out into the open. And then from now on, we're going to be conscious of them. We're going to be aware of them, and we can kind of just study ourselves, which I think is a really good thing to be able to do, to study yourself and understand yourself better. Again, like I said at the beginning, there's so much overlap between language and culture that I really think that if you want to understand a culture, you have to understand their language, because so much of the way they view the world is encoded in the words they use and the way they use those words. So if you want to increase your multicultural literacy, I would definitely encourage you to learn languages. It really helps you see the world through other people's eyes and walk a mile in their shoes in a way that you might not be able to otherwise. In the modern university, and maybe even in modern high schools, there's been a focus away from teaching languages. People are saying that maybe they're less important to learn. I think it's the opposite. I think they're more important to learn than ever, because again, as the world becomes a smaller place and we become a more global society, we're coming more, into contact with other cultures, and we want to be able to see the world through their eyes. We don't want to see them as enemies. We don't want to see them as people we don't like or don't understand. We want to be able to say, I may not be part of your culture, but I understand a little bit about where you're coming from. And the best way to do that is to learn the language of a given culture. So I think language is really important as we become a more multicultural world.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Tomato. I've been Talia Sherman. Special thanks to Professor Luke Gorton from the University of New Mexico and to all the people who helped get him on my podcast. Eleza, Kort, and Jim Kernohan, thank you so very much. Please stay tuned for next week's episode, when I will interview Professor Heather Littlefield from Northeastern University. See you then. Bye.